Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's my first time at MOCAD, and I'm very impressed. It's beautiful and big, and the shows are wonderful. So what more is there? Tonight, my talk may or may not be about social practice. I'm not sure, but you can decide afterwards. What I am going to talk about is an exhibition called The Possible, which is a recent show that happened at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, January 29th to May 25th of this year, I guess. And it was an exhibition curated by an artist by the name of David Wilson. He's not the David Wilson of the Museum of Jurassic Technology. He's a different David Wilson who lives in Berkeley. And it was a very large show, very experimental in temperament, and a show which I guess you could say did in its essence, embodies some of the principles of social practice, but never identified itself as a social practice project. So as you can see, it involved, at minimum, 80 artists. Ultimately, there were probably 200 or 300 who were involved, 9 studios, 17 workshops, and it was ultimately, I think, a project that was incomprehensible. And you'll see why. So this is the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, which some of you have probably seen before. It is a remarkable building, a concrete building, not unlike this in kind of its steely affect. And it's a wonderful building in some ways and a very challenging building in others. It's wonderful because it's built in a double helix. It's wonderful because you can go up on those sort of lookout perches and look down across galleries, look down into that central atrium space, which is a 7,000 square foot space. And so there's an opportunity that the building kind of, it calls out for a certain kind of behavior, which is not the behavior of paintings. It's not the behavior of sculptures. The building really seems to be asking for something to happen in its space and for something to be witnessed. And I think that at the time that it was made, it was designed in the late 60s, finished in 1970, I think the vision of the architects for sure, and maybe of others at the time, was that art was going to evolve in the direction of performance or some kind of social engagement, because what they built for the museum is effectively an amphitheater. It's a stage for action. So we decided to let that happen, and we began a series of performative events in that space called Late, and over the course of the past 5 years have had about 135 late events, which have involved dance and music and film and all kinds of activities. All the programs guest curated. We just had the last one a week ago with Terry Riley, the great musician and composer, performing for 3 hours in the grand piano in the center of the space, surrounded by 600 pot-smoking Berkeley hippies. It was great. It was really awesome. Anyway, David Wilson was one of the guest programmers and performers in the Late series. And I'll tell you a little bit about David. This is David right here, looking kind of Boisean shaman-ish. David is both a visual artist. He makes paintings and drawings of a quite naturalistic variety, I would say. He does plein air, landscape, ink paintings. That's one of his practices. Yes? Oh, so this is changing, but that isn't. What do I do? So this is the image that I thought you were seeing of the inside of the museum. Now you can see what I was talking about, I hope. The big atrium space and the kind of the lookouts and the double helix. This is David Wilson, the Boisean shaman I was telling you about, who curated the exhibition ultimately. This is earlier on when he was doing a performance in the space. So David Wilson, again, sort of bifurcated practice. On the one hand, kind of traditional artist, representational paintings, but this other practice is as an organizer of other artists. And for quite a number of years, he has been putting together these events, which he doesn't really put a name to, but they are, in effect, festivals that might last for an afternoon or a day or a weekend. I invited David to curate an exhibition in the museum and to basically take the museum as a site, to consider it the same way he considered that eucalyptus forest, and not to strip away necessarily its institutional identity or history. On the contrary, to embrace that, but also to think of it as a quasi-natural site, a kind of a physical form, and to occupy it and extend it in a way, bringing his networks into the museum. And instead of doing a festival that lasted a day or two, to do a festival, if you will, that lasted 4 months. So that was the initial invitation to David to bring his art magic into the museum. I just wanted to show a couple slides of things that are precedents, I guess you could say, that inform some of the things that are going on in the Bay Area right now, and certainly inform David's practice. And in particular, I think there's a lot that one can find in the Bauhaus and its aftermath, its resonances, that I think is very strongly part of the culture right now in the Bay Area. So this is a really wonderful picture of one of the many festivals that Oskar Schlemmer organized for the Bauhaus in its early years, between 1919 and 1922, something like that. Oskar Schlemmer was in charge of the festivals. He was like the leader of the festivals. And this is, I think this might be the Kite Festival, but I'm not sure. So the Bauhaus, contrary to our image of it, was actually a very playful place in the early years, and that sense of playfulness and experimentation is certainly part of the culture in the Bay Area right now. Another thing that may not have emerged for the first time at the Bauhaus, but it certainly became part of the vernacular of the art culture, I think, for the first time at the Bauhaus, was this idea of the artist as a whole person, and that particularly that a school would educate one not only to draw better, but that you'd also have, physical exercises. They even taught sex at the Bauhaus in the early years, and nutrition. So it was and spirituality. All these things were considered part of what it meant to be an artist. There were actually some Bauhaus figures who made it personally to the Bay Area. Marguerite Wildenhain had been a student at the Bauhaus and set up a ceramic studio in Marin County called Pond Farm Workshop. There were a number of others who brought, personally that experience to the Bay Area. The California College of the Arts, formerly the California College of Arts and Crafts, was founded, and I think the same year as the Bauhaus, and came out of very much that same experience. Margaret Wildenhain ultimately taught at CCA, and you can really see CCA as kind of a West Coast Bauhaus. Anna Halprin, who is an incredible person, I'm sure you've all heard of her, a dancer and choreographer, who is now 95 years old and still teaching dance classes and still dancing herself. Very, very much part of the contemporary fabric of Bay Area art culture. She teaches workshops like every week and for young people. And she was not at the Bauhaus herself, but studied with Walter Gropius, was friends with Gropius after he had emigrated to the United States and was at Harvard. So back to the possible, this show that we're talking about. So one of the things that is really, I think, fundamentally Bauhausian about the possible, this exhibition, was the way in which it leveled the distinction and the hierarchy among art, craft, and design. So it really did not distinguish in any kind of hierarchical fashion between these different types of practice. And every aspect of the show, from the furniture to the mailings, were considered part of an integrated whole. So this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which was really essential to the Bauhaus, I think, was enacted by the exhibition. And one example of the extent to which this ideology was deployed was in the invitations. So we have a membership list of about 3,000 people, and David Wilson insisted that every single member get a handwritten invitation that was hand-delivered. So to accomplish this, he had to get together a group of about 80 volunteers, each of whom had I don't know, 100 or whatever number of members that they personally had to hand deliver to. In order to accomplish this incredibly personal thing, he got some Silicon Valley tech guy to write a program which determined whatever it was, 80 different routes. If you divided those members by the 80 different routes, what was the shortest possible distance per route that you could, turn it into? So it was there was a high-tech thing underneath it, but the end result was, the affect was very personal. The exhibition occupied almost the entire museum, which I think was very important. It wasn't like we were taking this weird idea and doing it in a corner. It was really like the museum became this experiment for 4 months. There were some other things happening in the museum at the time, but this show took up almost the whole museum. On the day the museum opened, one of the galleries looked like this. It had nothing in it but an empty platform, which was designed for the show by a fellow named Corey Gerard, a wonderful local designer and artist. And so the people who came to the show in the first week or two would see this platform with nothing on it. It was a beautiful platform and brightly lit, but it really, I think, if it said anything, it said something about this sense of possibility of what was to come, because in fact, everything that ultimately ended up on this platform was made in the exhibition in one of the workshops that were brought into the museum. So when the exhibition started, David Wilson brought together the artists that he had engaged to participate in the show, and this was an image of him on the day before the show opened talking to the artists who had agreed to participate as sort of formally. Ultimately, the show had a lot more artists involved informally, but these are the ones who agreed to be involved and who were in fact paid to be involved. They were artists who were running the clay studio, the print studio, the weaving studio, the sound studio, all these different areas of the exhibition. They're all gathered on Fritz Haig's rag rug, and this was a truly social practice project. I think Fritz would use that terminology, that Fritz began, I think, at MoMA in New York, and then it traveled to the Walker, and at every site, the visitors would add to the rings, like adding to the rings of the tree, by adding new strips of cloth from donations. And you could see on the side there was some donated cloth, and people continued to add at Berkeley. But the rug also served as a kind of a focal point for the meetings and dialogues and performances that happened as part of this exhibition. So here's Fritz, that's him going like that. You may recognize him enacting a scored performance that I think he developed with Anna Halprin. He worked with Anna on his choreography for this exhibition. And here he's working with probably just some people who happened to be in the museum at that time performing this scored project. So here you can see the rug functioning as a kind of a stage or a zone for activity. This is the rug serving as a stage from which to perform. So here the audience is arrayed around the rug, and the performer, who's actually, I think it's Jean Renaud, wearing an outfit that was made in the textile studio of the exhibition. And here's some members of the audience just lying down and listening to music being played. This is the textile studio. So as I said, the exhibition, one of its core premises was to bring making into the museum and to not so much to display it as just to engage it, to have the making practice not be separated from the display practice, and to also to juxtapose different making practices. Certainly, schools like the Bauhaus were one of the inspirations for this. Probably the strongest inspiration, though, is provided by Creative Growth, Creativity Explored, and NIAD, which are 3 schools, not really schools, workshops for adults with developmental disabilities in the Bay Area, where the artists who participate in these programs can go for as long as they want, for their entire lives, in fact, and they exist in their, from 9 to 5, 5 days a week, in an environment where all the media surround them, multiple artists are working in the same place, day in and day out. And it's a very different studio situation than most artists are used to, and one that is incredibly fruitful. If you look at the work that's coming out of Creativity Explored to Creative Growth, the number of successes is much greater than at most art schools. Lance Rivers, who's in this exhibition, is at Creativity Explored, one of these schools. So we wanted to experiment with juxtaposing these different media and giving artists a place to work side by side. So once we had brought this equipment and the materials into the museum, and here you can see a loom, and it was one of 6 looms that were brought into the museum. There's that big cube is an indigo dye pot. There were some artists who were invited to participate formally, but many other artists just decided halfway through the show that they'd love to be involved. All they had to do was ask. There was free materials. Anybody who wanted to participate could. And this is just a fun illustration of another precedent. This is William Morris in 1887 at the first Arts and Crafts exhibition in London. It's a drawing by Edward Burne-Jones, and I think, underlying the Bauhaus is the arts and crafts movement, and if you really look back at the roots of all this stuff, it's in William Morris and his friends in England in the arts and crafts movement. So here's some of the textiles that were treated with natural dyes during the course of the exhibition. As the exhibition evolved, many people kind of came out of the woodwork, and David, utilizing his networking tentacles, brought some remarkable people in to teach workshops and things like dyeing with mushrooms. And so most of the programs, the so-called public programs in the show, were not planned in advance. There was a chalkboard, and as people would just be passing through, or someone would say, well, how about this person? You just write on the chalkboard, so-and-so is coming at 2 o'clock, and there would be a gathering, and people would learn something. This is the museum on a typical day, and I'll tell you, there were a lot more people in the museum when we had the show up than before or after, and it was really felt great. So here you see people working in the textile lab, putting together some textiles that have been made on the looms. And then on the other side, on the right side, is the print studio. One of the things that was important about the show was that it extended beyond the walls of the museum in a lot of different ways. Just one example of dozens was that the indigo dye that we used in the dye vat was grown at an experimental farm north of Berkeley, and participants in the exhibition, which could be artists or volunteers, went and harvested the indigo. So I had that opportunity to, farm to soup pot, and there it is, the indigo vat. 4 chambers for 4 different recipes of indigo dye. There's some folks having fun with the indigo vat. And here's some things that were made in the indigo vat. And this person that you see here is Yoshiko Wada, who is one of the country's great textile artists. And the show was remarkable and fun and successful, I think, in part for the way that it brought together some of the most talented and skilled artists and craftspeople in the area, indeed in the country, working side by side with maybe someone who had never done indigo before. And it was very informal and spontaneous, and everyone seemed to have a good time. So here you can see they even started experimenting with using indigo dye on wood, and I think with very beautiful results. Another sort of extension of the show outside of the museum walls was a collaboration with Creative Growth, which is the Center for Adult Artists with Developmental Disabilities. It's the branch that's in Oakland. And the artists in the textile studio at the Possible collaborated with the artists at Creative Growth to do a fashion line. So here they are learning about what they're going to be doing, and then here is the fashion show at which the Creative Growth artists wore the clothes that they had made and designed in the Possible, and this was quite a remarkable event. The print studio was just as engaging and tumultuous as the textile studio. In the print studio, you could do Xerox, Risoprint, silk screen, bookmaking, bookbinding, and there were people there every hour that the museum was open, just dropping in. All the materials were free, and anybody could do basically whatever they wanted to do. Some people made art, some people made political posters, some people, I don't know what they did. They did all sorts of things. So here's just people working in the print studio. Chris Johansson came by and did this print. He just stopped by one day and made that. This is a Lonnie Holly, who also is a wonderful artist from Alabama and musician. Happened to be passing through the Bay Area on his music tour and did a print. He also made a number of sculptures and ultimately did a concert and a recording session. He had not been programmed when the show started. We didn't even know he was coming through. This is one of the zines that was made. And then the clay studio, where you could do modeling clay or clay on the wheel, was very active. This is Darren Wilson. So each one of these studios had someone, at least one person, usually 2 or 3, who were hired to be there every day during the course of the show to bring some practical knowledge to whatever the medium was and to make sure the studio was kept clean. So Darren Wilson was one of those people. And one of the extensions of this studio out into the world was that at a certain point, about halfway through the show, all the clay that had been made up to that point was taken up to the Pope Valley kiln, an anagama kiln, which you see here. And the cool thing about an anagama kiln is that it's fired over the course of 10 days, and it has to be fed wood 24 hours a day for that period of time. So again, it was a time for David to call on his network of volunteers, and they all went up there and camped out and fed the fire. And this is the material after it's come out of the kiln, and then it was brought back to the museum. This is a piece by Ruby Neri, who is a wonderful Los Angeles-based sculptor, happens to be the daughter of Manuel Neri. And this is the piece that she made, I think after it was fired in the kiln. So one of the other components of the show was a space that was designed for kids, and the idea was to create a space where kids could have a kind of a commensurate experience, the same kind of access to materials and making and cross-disciplinarity. But we developed it a little bit differently. It was really the only part of the show for which we borrowed a pre-existing artwork. And it was this incredibly wonderful piece by Charles Long, which is a grid of little shelves, and on each shelf when the piece is first installed, there's just a block of single colored clay, so it looks like this minimalist sculpture. But audience members are invited to take the clay, take it apart, recombine it, and make sculptures. And indeed, after the sculptures are made, you can take apart someone else's sculpture and change it. So it's an ever-evolving participatory thing, and it's never uninteresting. So here's the kids doing their thing. It was designed for kids, but in fact it was all ages. Anybody could come down here and play with the clay. There's an example of one of the pieces. There was also a gigantic felted rug, which was made in the textile studio, which was a base from which the kids would make collages and drawings and things like that. There they are doing their thing. And this was a board on which we put the responses to a mail art invitation that David had sent out to every second and third grade student in the city of Berkeley. So he kind of probably addressed them personally to every single one of these students, inviting them to respond to some kind of prompt to make an image of some kind. And as each group of kids came into the museum, here's a class of about 15 kids, we would put up those kids' responses, which had been mailed back to us. So they'd come into the museum and they'd see their own thing, and they were very excited. But it was done as a palimpsest, so we never took anything down. It was just things kept being added, and it turned into this kind of remarkable all-over composition. One of the other galleries was devoted to a Bay Area collective called The Something, which is Sean Odell, you may have heard of, is kind of the one of the leaders of it, although I think they really think of themselves as a collective in seriously political terms, so Sean probably wouldn't want to be thought of as the leader, but he played an instrumental role. And the Some Things project was, you could think of it in a way as the technology studio of the possible. So if we had the clay and the printmaking and the textiles, this was the studio for video and sound. But it had another element, which was that because it was organized by a collective, it was also a political workshop, because they were experimenting the whole time with the principles of organization and decision-making. How were they deciding what to put up? How were they negotiating control and authority and all of this? So there were a lot of kind of political seminars that went along with this, and reading groups and whatnot, all of which was open to the public. But the overall vibe in this space was very playful, and you could just come and use this equipment, the video recorders, the sound equipment, and people were in here all the time making things. There were costumes, and it was a very anarchic and fun place to be. But it was different every day. You never knew what it was going to look like when you went in there. And in fact, one day I went up there. I was actually taking one of the donors to the show up there, and there was nothing in the gallery except this big white mountain that was covered with plastic. And the guard came up to me and us. I was with these donors, and was very excited. And he said, "Isn't it wonderful? They've taken it all away." And I thought, "Oh, great." And he said, "They decided to start over." And so they did. That was it. They just got tired of themselves, I guess. And in a normal museum show, that would not be a welcome occurrence. But in the possible, it was just great. So one of the other workshops was the physical activities workshop, which was organized by a guy named Drew Bennett, whose daytime job is that he is the head of the Analog Research Institute at Facebook. So it's interesting to know that Facebook, probably one of the most successful digital technology companies on Earth in history, has in its orbit something called the Analog Research Institute, where they are investigating the value of personal interaction and things that are made by hand and things of this kind. So normally what they do is on the Facebook campus, and it's meant to be sort of an in-house project, but we invited him to come up and do some stuff at the museum. So he organized a series of activities based on game theory and bringing in physical education ideas. So you can see some folks over in the corner there of the garden doing some kind of yoga maybe. And then one of the other things he did, which was really wonderful, challenging from the museum's perspective, but ultimately very successful, was he built an outdoor shower in the garden where people could come and clean off after their rigorous physical exercise. So I didn't think this was going to work. I thought people are not going to take their clothes off in the museum garden. It's just not going to happen. But they did. Hundreds of people of all kinds. It seems like this is really an unmet need in the museum field. And there they are. And then lastly, one of the really interesting spaces was the library, what David called the library. All the furniture in the library, to begin with, was designed for the show by this company called Ansver Farms, which is two artists in San Francisco who also make furniture, and it's really wonderful furniture. And then what was contained in the library was a number of different things. There were vitrines around the outside in which were collected materials from the museum's archives relating to exhibitions that were similarly experimental or collaborative or involving of artists. Because as I mentioned before, I wanted David not only to respond to the physical qualities of the building, but also its history. And so this was a way to kind of engage that more discursive context. At the very beginning of the show, in fact, about 6 months before the show opened, David sent out a survey to 300 or so artists around the country, asking them about influences, works of art, music, and things of that kind. So one of the things in the library was every book that was mentioned as an influence by artists who were participating. These are actually the responses to the survey itself. We also had a slideshow with images of every artwork or artist that was mentioned as an influence. Really the only thing that I did in the show, although initially I was a co-curator, but ultimately I kind of let David take over. But my one contribution was this vitrine you see on the bottom there, which was a collection of vintage Alan Lomax photographs that I borrowed from the National Archives. I'm sure you know Alan Lomax was a great collector of American folk music. It's not so well known that while he was recording all this music, he was also taking photographs, and they were very, very beautiful photographs. So these were the original prints. I think they've never been out of the National Archives, and people could look at them. The reason this was in the show is because one of the themes of the exhibition was about archiving and about this idea of preserving knowledge and preserving practices, and doing that in a kind of a community of archiving, I guess you'd call it. So not only did we have these images of the recordings, we had the recordings themselves, so you could actually listen to the recording that he was making when he took those photographs. The records that you see on the shelves there are all the music that the artists referred to, and also some examples of contemporary archiving like Lomax, like Dust to Digital, which is a Mississippi-based, it's Mississippi or Alabama-based organization that is taking records and old records and digitizing them. One of the other archives that we had in the show was Mandy Aftel's archive of scent. She's a Berkeley-based perfumer and has this amazing collection of aromatic butterflies and weird machines related to the production of scent. So this is the platform that I showed you at the very beginning, and I just have a short sequence of slides showing how over the course of the show, the accretion of objects, which was all curated by David Wilson. So every week he would sort of look around and see what had been made that week. It could be something made by a very well-known artist. It could have been made in the kids club. There's something, anything at all. And he put it here on this platform. One of the, also from an institutional perspective, maybe the most revolutionary things about this show was that the whole exhibition was declared a registrar-free zone. So nothing was secured. There were no guards, and there were no vitrines. Anybody could have walked off with any of this stuff. And remarkably, no one did. Nothing went missing during the course of the show. So this is how it looked at the very end. So yeah, the show lasted 4 months, and it was a big challenge for the museum, but the response from the community was very strong, and many people said, you have to find a way to continue this, at least some piece of it. And so we have hired David to continue to work for the museum when we open in our new building next year, to somehow keep some of these things going in a sustainable way. The degree to which this was happening in the museum over those 4 months was not sustainable. It was driving the staff crazy, and it was unaffordable. So we're trying to find a way to keep some threads of this practice continuing on an ongoing basis. So this kind of energy will always be part of the Berkeley Art Museum. Thank you. Yes, a question from the back. Yes. So the old building, which we're actually still in through December 21st, opened in 1970, and it's a wonderful building, but it was discovered that it is not seismically sound. It's structurally not adequate for our proximity to the Hayward Fault in particular, which is just a few hundred feet away. So it's a dangerous building, so we have to leave. And we've been working to design and build a new museum. Diller, Scofidio, Renfro are the architects, and it's under construction now. It'll be done in July. And in some ways it's not as good as the one we have. It doesn't have a 7,000 square foot atrium. But it's better in other ways. The location is better. It's a block from the public transportation train, the BART train. The galleries are more versatile. There's more diversity among the galleries. We'll have 2 theaters instead of 1. So it's going to be great, but we're compelled to do it. We have no choice. Nobody knows what's going to happen to it. It will cost a minimum, they tell me, of $40 or $50 million to retrofit it seismically, and perhaps more importantly, what that retrofitting would entail is cutting up that vast interior space. So it may not be worth saving because it's not going to be the same. You'd lose probably the most wonderful thing about it, which is that interior space. Mario Chianti. He was a San Francisco-based architect, not particularly well known. But this building is famous, I guess you could say, as an example of brutalism. But it's an interesting kind of brutalism. Many brutalist buildings, so-called, like the Whitney Museum, Marcel Breuer did a number of brutalist buildings, tended to be concrete, very solid, very earthbound. But this building, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is designed in the form of a double helix and is in fact very dynamic in its form. So it's a peculiar building and maybe unique in brutalism for being simultaneously hard as rock and, with literally concrete and figuratively, but also suggesting this kind of dynamism and energy, which is a very difficult thing to do when you're dealing with hundreds of tons of concrete, and somehow he pulled it off. Yes, Laura.
So at the very beginning, you were cautious about talking about this exhibition under the term social practice. Can you talk more about why you paused and that kind of terminology?
Yeah, well, I've never heard David use that terminology, and he was the curator of the show. He's an artist, but he's also the curator of the show. And I didn't, and actually till the show was up, I didn't ask him whether he thought this show was art or not. And then when I asked him, he said it was. And I thought, that's okay. But from my perspective, from a museum administration standpoint, if you can call it that, and a museum identity standpoint, I felt that it was important not to frame the show as art because that would elide the museum's responsibility for the show in some way. It would say, okay, whatever this is, success or failure, and it was a big experiment that could have fallen flat on its face. We could have just said, okay, it's art, I wanted it to be museum practice. I wanted the museum to really own it, and that's one of the reasons why it was took up almost the whole museum. And so I thought, in a way, and maybe it's just in this case, maybe it's actually a worry that I have in general, that social practice is a kind of bet hedging. It's not full on somehow. It's not full on politics. It's not full on whatever. In this case, it was very specific, though, to the fact that David Wilson has never said he was a social practice artist, and that I wanted this to be museum practice from my perspective. I wanted my staff to feel that this was their responsibility, not an artist's responsibility. Yeah.
I'm somewhat familiar with the history of the Berkeley Art Museum and the types of exhibitions that have been done there, but not super familiar with the breadth.
Yeah.
But it strikes me as that this type of exhibition is pretty unusual, and the way that you describe the space also as a series of sort of stages or platforms or areas for like a theater space. would just be this kind of, or a straightforward
Yeah.
contemporary art or even modernist style.
Yeah. In fact, if you look back in the archives, and this was one of the, I mentioned in the library, David looked back into the archives and found lots of evidence that going back, particularly into the 70s, the museum was used like this a lot. I mean, it was kind of creepy. We found these pictures that looked like they were shot in the show, you know. And some of them without, you know, it was unclear what the exhibition was, but it was like the same people doing the same things. I think that the challenge to live up to what the building is asking for, it's just overwhelming. I mean, it's so utopian in a way and so counter the normal narrative. It's very difficult. I mean, if you could imagine kind of doing this kind of thing for the past 40 years, I mean, it's just exhausting thinking about. So yeah, the museum did lapse into more, even after this show, more regular, put the art on the wall, write the text and sort of thing, which is also good. I mean, I love that kind of thing too. I would love to see an institution be born that actually did this kind of thing all the time, maybe in that building if they can fix it. But in answer to your question, I think it is probably coincidental that this show happened just before we're leaving the building for the seismic reasons. I think even if we were going to be staying there for the indefinite future, if I had known, you know, seen these things that David was doing, I would have invited him to come and do this anyway. So it wasn't really about this kind of apocalyptic condition of that site. Although David, like in the catalog, even in my essay, I allude to it a bit. It's hard to escape the fact that this is a show that is towards the end, and it has a little bit of an elegiac quality. But I think it would have happened anyway. Sorry, long-winded answer. Yes? Yeah. So it looks like what we're going to do is continue to have a paper studio. Of all these media, paper is the one that's the most sustainable in a way, both in terms of cost and the logistics of it. It's a lot easier than having a clay studio or a textile studio. So we do have an area of the new building that will be turned into a place for printmaking, bookmaking, and paper production. We will staff that with someone who knows the equipment for drop-in visits. David will bring in guest artists to do special projects in that space. David will continue to program performances and lectures, and so we will be continuing some of the making aspect, some of the performative aspect, and we'll see. I mean, David's on board to kind of just continue to think this through, so yet to be determined. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just wondered if you might comment on that all of a sudden, you know, there are clay artists in New York
Mm-hmm.
who were making sculptures who are now making clay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's okay to be
Yeah.
clay if you're an artist, whereas, you know, manual Neri was never accepted.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you know, it's a tendency that has been percolating in our culture since the mid-19th century. I mean, you really see this with William Morris trying to challenge the hierarchy of the fine arts over the crafts. He was, you know, maybe the first one in the modern era to really articulate this. And he did it as part of a political and social agenda to bring dignity to craftspeople and workers, and to, in his case, it was coming out of that. But his ideology very much informed the Bauhaus, and it was continued there for other purposes. That ultimately became more driven by industrial and capitalized situations, marketing and whatnot. But all of that trickled down, both from the arts and crafts movement, from the Bauhaus, to many different parts of the United States. Some nodes, maybe more than others. I think this area is one of them that got a little bit stronger of an injection of this sensibility than other places. And it's percolated along quietly, but interestingly, the dominant mainstream art market has, value in the arts is based on difference and exclusion. There's the things that are of value are the yeses, and they're the yeses because other things are rejected. So those lines exist to demarcate and ensure the value. And for the past 100 years, painting has been in the yes column, and craft has been in the no column. I mean, but I think part of the change we're seeing is that finally, and it's just kind of by a kind of attrition, I don't think it's due to any particular individual. It's a fundamental change in the culture that the market has begun to accept this broader scope of things. So that's part of it. I think that there's an economic dimension to it. I think part of it is the willpower of communities outside of the center, like in the Bay Area, where the market has been relatively less important. And I think the kind of things that you see in The Possible of this kind of just disregard for those distinctions comes from an absence of market opportunity, and it comes from the natural discourse and forms of association among creative people who, why not make friends with and share and learn from someone who's doing indigo dyeing and put your sculpture in the indigo vat. I mean, a lot happens, I think, outside of the mainstream centers, where so much of the attention, both critical and on the production side, is about perpetuating givens and things that are known to work. And by work, I mean, for the most part, sell. So there is, I think it's in the Bay Area, it's, this kind of thing has thrived in part because it has stood outside of the market. I think it's coming up more nationally, this kind of interdisciplinary approach, because the market is extending to embrace these kinds of things. For what reason, I'm not sure. Yeah. Hi. Oh, hey, Barry.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the recognizability of that high-low mix in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Sort of recall that the state that the arts in the Bay Area was in when I was back there writing for Art Week. And if you were to look at, that was 89 and 94, and then before I came here, if you were to go back and look at such that publication now, I mean, you see a similar kind of juxtaposition of, very craft-oriented work, and then a kind of, I think at the time, like a certain mix of where we're going to go if we're in San Francisco. There was, quite a lot of uncertainty, I think, about the high. There's a very definite baseline of a kind of commonality around craft.
Mm-hmm.
And in the period that I was working, my beat was the language beat.
Mm-hmm.
The conceptual beat. So I was following the development of, that line of work that, came out of San Francisco,
Right.
but also adopted practices using language. And, that's an evolution as well. And, but I think one of the effects that had was a kind
Mhm.
show, I would say, one thing with the archive, is in fact conceptually based or
Mhm.
language based. But I'm not convinced that the archive is, as an art making principle, as opposed to material practices and crafts. I'm seeing the archive being absorbed really into something that's been going on in the Bay Area for some time.
Mm.
Be a little bit of a counter position here.
Mhm.
And I do think that there are a number of exhibitions around. The one that's been here, Berlin, certainly is a
Mhm.
site for work that is distributed among different activities. I think it's highly interdisciplinary and is coming at a kind of political edge, and as a critique.
Mhm.
I do think that there are there are a number of strands of that. If you could compare the Bay Area's version of it.
Mhm.
That's another comment, really, that
Mhm.
is a kind of family resemblance here between what the Bay Area has to offer in history. But I do think that something of the criticality of that, or maybe even antagonism of that earlier that language and
Mhm.
moment might be a little bit lost in all over this.
Yeah. Right. Well, it definitely is a different sensibility, and this is not a historical exhibition. It's not a summation of, what was going on in the past or even what's going on in the present. And there is currently a lot of forms of art making, culture making, we could call it, that didn't find its way into this show, even though the show had kind of a affect of encyclopedicness. There's very rigorous formalist work being made in the Bay Area now, conceptual work that, yeah, I mean, there were some things in here that maybe were crossover points, but this was, in part a sensibility driven by the curator's networks and his interests and the communities that he arranged around him. So you could probably do another show even today that, Bay Area conceptual art that looked nothing like this. I think that it would be interesting, I suppose, and this might be an academic exercise, to think about the ways in which these two strands, which I think are both very strong in the Bay Area, actually, might have points of commonality. You might hate this comment, but I'll offer it anyway, that there's a certain way in which language poetry is a kind of craft poetry, possibly. So, yeah, we could discuss that.
Is it conceptual poetry or is it material?
Something like that, yeah.
The questions of materialism.
Right, right, right. Other questions, thoughts? No? All right, well, thank you very much.